So this video has changed in scope roughly 5 times since I started making it, and while this mostly consisted of addressing the different controversies, the 11th Developer's Backyard released and confirmed Bridget to be a trans girl, so like half of this script was deleted. The current script is mostly the same in nature and subject matter, just with large sections completely cut out or just reworked to go with the new thesis of the video. So to recap, Bridget was introduced to Guilty Gear 20 years ago with Guilty Gear XX. Created to be the cute character, series creator Daisuke Dishwater opted to making the cute girl a boy because he thought it would be funny, I guess. And this somehow led to Bridget being the defining character of the trap crossdresser genre for long enough stretch of time to have been the inspiration for Boku no Pico. This reign of terror lasted until the doomsday year of 2014 when Type Moon kidnapped medieval paladin Astolfo from the ancient history books and turned him into the femboy superstar seen in every edgy guy's Discord profile picture. Strive gave us the long-awaited return of Bridget for Season 2 DLC Character Slot 1, and on a surprise because everyone thought it was going to be Exart's most hated himbo. Bridget, possessing a legacy that somehow exists far beyond the series, created a massive boom in sales, tripling the Steam player base upon release. And then people played her arcade mode, which sees this event occur.
Cowgirl is fine, because I'm a girl.
And somehow this managed to be tremendously confusing, with people saying, oh no, it was actually a bad ending. It doesn't happen in the perfect route, where Bridget's still a boy, I guess? I was gonna give a bunch of detailed reasons as to how this narrative doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's more so jumping through mental hoops, but it doesn't matter what refutations I was going to give to the bad endings. Word of God said Bridget is a girl, and bad ends aren't a thing in Strive, so that's been laid to rest. I want to say for like a month that this was the sole controversy surrounding the character, but now you kind of had two major fronts, one of which still survives, that being the grooming narrative. Now for context, in XX, we meet Bridget and learn the character was born one of two identical male twins to a family of British aristocrats. Turns out, Bridget's hometown had a weird superstition that twin boys meant bad luck, or something, and the options were abandon or kill one. Bridget's parents, not wanting to crucify their femboy messiah of a child, and also unwilling to just move to a town that wasn't fucking weird, opted for what they thought to be the most logical option, and just gaslit the entire town into thinking Bridget was a girl. And so then we reach the question, was Bridget groomed into being trans? No, because grooming is when a pedophile preps a child for a meeting, often via the internet, with the intention of committing a sexual offense. And grooming is at this point a buzzword so overused that its definition is getting murky and becoming devoid of meaning. The term you're looking for is gaslit. So then was Bridget gaslit? Also no, it's never said that anyone actually tried to convince Bridget she was born a girl. And further, it's actually elaborated that her parents feel guilty for having made her live a lie, implying that she grew up being told, look, we know you're a boy, but just tell everyone you're a girl so you don't get strung up like Jesus Christ. At 14, Bridget leaves her village in GGXX. For 5 fucking years, the little gremlin is free to do whatever and dress however. By Strive, she's 19 and has spent more than a quarter of her life free to deny the feminine identity and choose masculinity or even androgyny, but ultimately decided that she liked the way she presented and liked being a girl. She just hated lying and the idea of being a burden. To counter-argue further that all that time to decide didn't matter because the damage of her upbringing was already done is tantamount to saying that large levels of exposure to gays as a child turned you homo. It just doesn't make any fucking sense. It's ultimately a narrative that people want to latch onto more than they don't, so you get the notion that by being trans, everything in XX to be more masculine was pointless. But wouldn't it have been pointless if Bridget was still the same femboy and undermined the entire quest to be as manly as possible? So then, instead, if Bridget actually came back as a masculine twink to justify that, would you honestly be happy with that? Anyways, you're allowed to not like the character direction. I don't think that makes you a transphobe. However, I think that insisting that the writing was wrong and refusing to accept it tends to imply a person might have an issue with trans people. And look, there are valid reasons to dislike this character direction, but grooming and bad ends are not some of those reasons. Bridget's initial depiction saw the character lean heavy into themes of androgyny and rejection of gender norms. However, Bridget identifying as a girl kind of tends to flip those aspects of the character by making Bridget instead opt to follow gender norms by now acting and appearing as her internal gender. Additionally, many non-binary or gender non-conforming men found representation in Bridget and now no longer feel that the character represents them. And while they still have testament, Bridget is likely what came first to them, so they're naturally attached to the character. I think it's perfectly valid to feel this way, but most people who feel this way with Bridget don't try and peddle the notion that it's all some sort of misunderstanding, and instead manage to be happy for trans women who now get to see themselves in Bridget. And on the other hand, trans people can also dislike Bridget now being trans for reasons of feeling that the character's history in fandom and the legacy she has leads her to potentially be a poor instance of representation for trans people, because redefining crossdressers as trans characters has the potential to make the two synonymous, and that can pose an issue. The idea is entirely debatable, and a trans person having that opinion does not make them a pick-me trans person, and it definitely does not validate any amount of harassment towards them in any form at all. But I mean, if you want to talk about pick-me grifters, look no further than Dimitri Monroe. Dimitri Monroe is a fucking weirdo to say the least. To keep it short, the dude is like this weird champion of traps that serves as the gender non-conforming poster child of all the people that still make attack helicopter jokes in the modern era and think that localization is a blight on humanity, but can't read or speak a word of Japanese. Naturally, being the absolute goblin that he is, he made a video on the subject matter. Now, originally I had this whole segment about how this dude's video was like a landfill of misinfo, but he deleted it, claiming that he rescinded it for misinformation purposes, but then said he stood by all of his earlier points, deleting it only for the final conclusion, which according to him was where all the misinfo was at as a result of the 11th backyard. However, his video cited bad ends amongst his prime evidence for his conclusion, which was also directly denied by Daisuke himself. Now, while I probably would have just ended this whole criticism of him being unfathomably stupid there, the literal vegetable decided to double down and re-upload the video with only the conclusory argument segment removed, leaving behind a gold medal in mental gymnastics. And so dunking on this man's lack of critical thinking skills is back on the table, and now I've got word of God to shout at the backboard.
Go now, my child.
Okay, father.
Starting off strong, Dimitri, with a failed understanding of Japanese, starts saying shit like this.
The Japanese bio directly states the character is a man, while the English makes itself as awkward as possible by never using a single pronoun for Bridget, opting to only say his name.
This shit is incredibly fucking false. The Japanese text lists the word Otokonoko spelled this way, meaning boy. In Japanese, the bio would say that Bridget was born a boy in the first sentence, and then no follow-up mention of the gender for the entire paragraph because Japanese is not a pronoun-heavy language like English is. The English translation is essentially the fucking same, saying that Bridget is born one of two sons. A son meaning boy. From there, a perfectly faithful translation is done that makes zero usage of gender references. This notion that the translation is peddling something it's not is really only told from people who either don't know anything about how Japanese functions and just used Google Translate, or have an agenda to tell. Dimitri Monroe is firmly in the agenda camp, with a vendetta against localization of material that doesn't suit his views, so he just decides to make shit up, opting entirely to lie with his hand placed firmly on the Astolfo Bible. Say the prayer, mis cuates.
En el nombre del Padre, Hijo y Espíritu Santo. Amen.
It doesn't take an insane level of research to know that Dimitri is lying out of his ass, especially when another YouTuber, Otaku Daikun, a person that also has a distaste for localizers and SJWs, going as far to cite all of the same Naoto and Astolfo-based points throughout his own video on the subject matter, had this to say about the bio on the website.
Thankfully, the official bio given to Bridget on Arc System Works' website is not only in line with previous titles, but is also accurate to its Japanese equivalent. You'll have to trust me on that, as I did do the research.
Now are you ready for it? That's right, it's time for Bad Ends, peddled from a person who has 20 minutes of gameplay and strive. Now, if you'll recall the prayer of our patron paladin, resident femboy fanboy is going to argue a non-existent context that makes no fucking sense.
One critical aspect of this that is left out when it was presented without context is that this took place in a non-canon dialogue exchange. As time passed, many were quick to point this out and call it a bad ending, followed by those that were cheering on social media saying Guilty Gear doesn't have bad endings. Which, again, I don't feel these people have interacted with any of these games because that's just plainly not the case with Strive.
Anyone who says that there was an absence of bad endings said it was in the case of Strive. As a series, and as a staple of arcade fighters, multiple endings have always been a thing. And even in XX, which has bad ends, no singular ending was actually canon. Rather, canon events are an amalgamation of selected events that occur through the different routes. Even still, bad ends are an outdated concept for the series and have been for 10 years and 2 major games, with the release of Exard, which didn't even feature alternative endings. But Dimitri didn't play that one because it didn't have Bridget. But ignoring all of that, the creator of the series said the bad ends aren't even a concept in Strive, So why keep this in the fucking video? If you had the gall to remove the conclusion because it was wrong, why didn't you remove this part as your primary evidence? And then doubling down on not understanding Japanese, we get to the line. You know the one.
I'm a girl.
Now I hope you're ready for just about the dumbest argument you've ever fucking heard. At least until his next one anyways. The lines in both languages are identical, unless you count saying cowgirl instead of young lady a noteworthy difference. But Dimitri has to figure out some refutation of the line, and so...
For those who know Japanese and the culture context of the actual scene, it is much more lighthearted. You see, in Japanese it's most common, when referring to oneself, to say I'm a man or woman, when talking about your actual gender, while I'm a boy or girl is used when talking about one's role. Even in English we have similar examples, such as someone saying stop being a girl when someone is being cowardly, or the term man up as another instance. It's a reference to the typical position of that gender.
Imagine not understanding either fucking language. This is about the dumbest comparison anyone could have made. To cite antiquated insults rooted in pointless, second-grade boys versus girls sexism, as if it's a one-to-one comparison to Japanese linguistics, is a stretch that only a contortionist could perform. But I guess you'd have to be one to misconstrue a language that you don't understand this fucking hard. And this stupid argument goes on for a while, only getting worse with each example. Look man, I've spent some time in Japan, but I'm not perfectly fluent in the language. My skill level is just enough to maintain small talk. However, it doesn't take a person with a PhD in Japanese linguistics to know that this shit is just wrong. Even if we are to assume that Dimitri's little comparison is one-to-one, that still implies that there's a limited context where calling oneself a young boy or girl rather than adult man or woman in Japanese still denotes identity as it would in English, despite the fact that the languages are worlds apart. But honestly, it's just a disingenuous red herring, especially now that we know from the 11th backyard that it is in fact a coming out scene, thusly disproving Dimitri's little context theory. But I don't know, who knows Japanese better, some otaku chud, or the Japanese dev team that made the fucking game? Gee, I wonder. From here, it's all just a disingenuous narrative, talking about femboy identity erasure and the erasure of the gender non-conforming. Talks of how the West only ever shoves words into the mouth of the Japanese, never considering that he would be doing the exact same thing when ultimately proven wrong days after the release of the original video. He actively chooses to misrepresent both East and West populaces when discussing the issue, saying that only the West views the trans ending to be true while the entirety of Japan views it the other way. And this is despite the fact that a quick search of Bridget's name online would find you the exact same arguments that you find happening here overseas. And in the end, it just culminates to this point saying,
while many will portray those that are upset as just being some sort of bigot, mad that the character isn't a femboy, let's think about that sentence for a moment. It doesn't make sense. Bigots, homophobes, don't fight for the existence of feminine dudes.
No, they actually will do that because they just hate the idea of trans women more, but he doesn't consider that option in order to exonerate his side of the argument from their usual criticism. But this is all coming from a guy that doesn't actually play Guilty Gear, skipped Exard, and thinks that Daisuke wasn't involved in the story.
This game isn't headed by the previously mentioned Daisuke Ishiwatari. Prior, this series was Daisuke's baby. He's still doing work with illustrations and certain compositions. It's not that he's completely stepped away, but he did hand over control to Akira Katano, the new director.
Oh, please don't wait for me, darling. Stay out on the cold rain, where your heart may become rusty. Oh, please don't wait for me, darling. Just stay safe and sound as long as you are there. I will figure it out, figure it out, figure it out for you once more.
What, did you see this in the credits and think that meant he wasn't still the chief visionary? It takes 5 minutes to see that he's listed in the exact same role in Exard before Katana was even director. Dimitri Monroe is a fucking moron, and to keep the video up, only deleting the conclusion was a load of bullshit. If the reason was for misinformation, then 90% of the video would need to be deleted, with bad ends and shit understanding of Japanese. But let's be honest, the original last segment wasn't even the fucking conclusion. The entire 5-minute section about the West and global narratives was the real conclusion. Putting the video back up and trying to recontextualize it as Japanese fans' confusion is just insincere because the video, its script, wasn't designed for that. It's rhetoric. The entire video is honestly just one big rhetoric push, choosing to highlight only the over-the-top and unnecessary behavior of people in favor of trans Bridget, almost as if an attempt to misrepresent the broader trans community and vilify them. I've said it before, and I will say it again. Disliking this character direction for Bridget does not necessarily make you a transphobe. The character means a lot of things to a lot of people and has had a huge influence on genres, but taking the actions of a group's most annoying individuals and using that to vilify the larger group simply because you feel that those individuals are doing the same to you is inherently hypocritical. As you can imagine from the content of the video thus far, I am not partial to a malicious portrayal of the trans community, and so I'm not a huge fan of the idea that any depiction of them in mass media has nothing to do with the director or writer's creative decisions and is rather entirely about pandering to the LGBT. Prior to the release of The 11th Backyard and looking at the different endings and unable to pick a lane, notorious Lore Dude Gear Project fell into the idea that it was an interpretatory ending for fans to make their own conclusions on, likening it to the idea of options in dating sims, as multiple endings occur in those kinds of games. However, this is more of a false equivalence because dating sims do have canon endings for respective girls and only vary in timeline based on the girl chosen. Whereas Guilty Gear has multiple endings, though a canon reality has always been set and is just not viewed by the player. Never has Guilty Gear simply been left up to the player for the sake of mass appeal. It is completely unprecedented for the series. Alternate endings may serve to enrich a character to expand their appeal to the player base. However, Guilty Gear has always had a favored character direction, and the idea that Bridget was somehow this unique case of bad ends and interpretations never before seen in the series until present controversy is due pretty much entirely to a confusion rooted in denial. Like, I don't know, dog, I feel like having a scene in which a character comes out on screen doesn't exactly scream the idea of mass appeal when it erupts the Mount Vesuvius of femboy addicts. Thinking that trans people is a demographic that needs to be pandered to is preposterous. By all measures, trans people make up a rough 1% of the world population, and the broader LGBT makes up an estimated 5% of US population, a pattern of which you can assume extends to global population. So let's ask the elephant-sized question. Why would anyone trying to sell as much of their product as possible bother to advertise to the lowest common denominator? That's a Crunchyroll level of shitty business model. So in cases like Guilty Gear, actions like these are clearly done with intent. Creators understand the controversy and risk that comes with giving explicit representation to a group as marginalized as trans people. To drive the point further, the major demographic for this game is obviously the Japanese audience. Strive aims to have an international market, and so a lot of precautions have been taken to that, such as changing Faust to appeal to a more worldwide market. But everyone knows that anime fighters are significantly larger in the Japanese market when compared to overseas, which often tends to rely on arcade sales as opposed to physical sales. So then why aim a narrative that gives LGBT representation to Japan of all places, a country that as of 2021 says that less than a third of the population thinks that LGBT people should be allowed to be open about their identities in the public sphere, as according to a poll conducted by Ipsos. The argument is just illogical. No one in their right mind would include that kind of a scene and then consider there to be no risk with it. It was an inevitability that some people would protest this and that a movement to boycott Strive would exist. Gay and trans characters in media are consistently polarizing after all. But people boycotting the game are people who honestly weren't big fans of Guilty Gear to begin with. After all, GG fans clearly bought the game a fucking year ago. The only people who held out on buying the game and therefore can boycott it are the people who only really know the series through Bridget, and were really only going to bother engaging with the game once Astolfo's mentor got added. Essentially the Bridget equivalent of horny bikin scrubs in early Strive saying, "No bikin, no buy, Ken." I know it's bottom of the barrel criticism to say that people don't engage with these games, but the world is rife with people who have opinions and conclusions unbacked by evidence. Look no further than in the case of the departure of BlazBlue creator Toshinori Mori from Arc System Works. It's never been clarified as to Mori's exact reason for leaving the company. But some people, like Hirohei, the YouTube equivalent of a Screen Rant article, covered the situation, choosing to discuss it simultaneously with the Bridget outrage and conflate the two, trying to imply that Mori's departure was due in part to Bridget and Arc System Works' political choices, when BlazBlue literally has Mai Natsume. I'm not even gonna bother explaining that one because the writing is on the fucking wall. Honestly, if I was Mori, I would leave Arxis too, because if the game that I made got turned into BB Tag, I would want to get as far away from it as fucking possible. And honestly, it's asinine to act like Arxis hasn't been like this the whole fucking time. This is like, what, their 5th, 6th fucking trans character at this point? And Venom has been gay for Zato and said that he doesn't like women for the last 20 years. You legitimately have to have not been interacting with this company or these games to act like Bridget's character direction is something new. And I'm not really gonna put effort to figuring out what group of people say the "but Japanese fans" thing, because that's honestly a dumb argument. It's a lost cause, and the level of overlap makes the effort about as pointless as boycotting Strive. Honestly, it's just insane copium, because the Japanese mauled it equally as hard over this, going as far to impersonate Arc System Works and put out a fake email that said that Bridget was still a boy, forcing Arc System Works to have to put out statements on all of their accounts saying that they had been impersonated and not to believe that email. But this isn't the be-all, end-all of the Japanese. Like I said earlier, you'd have to be huffing more glue than a Slayer player to think that the Japanese weren't having the exact same arguments over Bridget's gender. Searching Bridget's name in Japanese on Twitter isn't exactly a 300 IQ idea, but it seems that no one actually bothered to try it because pretty fast you find tweets in both camps. This legit took me less than 2 minutes to find. Even more to the point, the complete ignoring the idea that there would have been Japanese trans people who saw the coming out scene and felt personally represented by it is just absurd. You'll have to search a bit harder, but you can still find posts like these. Like this one from a Japanese trans woman who felt at the moment that Bridget said really resonated with her. Or what about this trans cosplayer who rushed to be the first Bridget cosplayer on the scene when the gender reveal happened? The idea that just because you go on Pixiv and Rule 34 and see that the tags still say Otokonoko, and that it somehow means the Japanese had a consensus that Bridget was still a boy this whole time, was nothing more than wishful thinking on the part of denial. The Japanese aren't some monolith of opinions, and to think that of them is little more than forcing your ideals onto them. That concept goes both ways. If you're bothering to ask, then why are they still using Otokonoko? Well, 1, imagine actually changing the tags on thousands of Bridget images across the entire internet. That's a fool's errand. But that's a lesser point. In reality, the bigger picture is that the American confusion of the continued usage of Otokonoko stems from a lack of understanding in which the Japanese language refers to the concept of being transgender. So to start, Otokonoko, said out loud in English, means boy. But in Japanese, it has 2 distinct spellings. One spelled this way, meaning boy, and the other written this way. This one transliterates to male daughter or male girl, denoted by how the ko-character is replaced with the one for musume. The term originated as a term for cross-dressers and often is translated to the similar femboy or tomgirl. Pick your poison, I don't really care. Otokonoko, in its male daughter format, is more of a larger umbrella term, used to identify cross-dressers and femboys. And while it can also be an insult for the gender non-conforming, it is alternatively sometimes even an LGBT-friendly term to refer to the gender non-conforming males when used in certain spaces. The closest equivalent I can think of is the English term of the usage queer, where it manages to be both an identifier in both insulting and reclaimed statuses. Japanese and English, however, are not one-to-one equivalents and exceedingly different in grammatical structure, speech pattern, and contextual makeup. So it's imperative to note that the way we normally know the word is through the context of anime and games, because let's be honest, that's the only situation in which most of us are hearing a single word of Japanese. Through this lens, Otokonoko as a genre almost exclusively means cross-dresser characters. In real-life Japanese usage, something that Americans naturally don't see, Otokonoko in the male-daughter context, despite its origins in anime slang, often sees use by androgynous, feminine men and transgender women in real life to label themselves. Since a person can call themselves whatever they want, it's difficult to imagine that this has any meaning beyond applying anime femboy trap genres onto oneself, and that's kind of because Otokonoko, as the West knows it, is basically just a borrowed word. Honestly, I think the simplest way to understand the context of Japanese is by understanding the borrowed words or concepts that see usage there. Japanese does have the borrowed word transgender, or transgender, but this word does not see much use beyond the definition of the T in the once again borrowed acronym LGBT. You'll often find trans people in Japan often using terms such as crossdresser or joso, meaning transvestite, particularly a male to female, but directly transliterating to female attire, a word crossdressing in origin. The similar danso denotes the same transvestite role, but for trans men. You'll find that words for transgenderism often have some relation to cross-dressing when translated literally. And to that end, if you search for trans Japanese women, you'll often find instances of them self-referring as Otokonoko alongside their cis cross-dressing counterparts. So while English speakers are making great pains to separate cross-dressing and transgenderism entirely, Japanese speakers are yet to fully make that linguistic differentiation. Due to the relative isolation of their culture, the Japanese language does not evolve as rapidly as English does. This is why we rarely see the Japanese having the same conversation as the West, and often them using terms that fell out of favor with the English speakers upwards of a decade ago. Keep in mind that their word may not mean what it directly translates to in English, as a word met with an antiquated translation by Google Translate may in actuality have a more modern localization. Hey, I hope you liked the video, and if you didn't, I'm honestly surprised you watched to the end. Most people would have closed out the tab. Look man, my goal here is not to call you a transphobe. It's to get people to not be so mean to trans people. It's totally fine to not like the character direction for Bridget. It's a big shift. You're not required to like it. You're also not required to be nice to others. But I think it would do you and everyone else a lot of favors to sometimes think about how hard it is just to exist sometimes, and say that it's okay to just live and let live, even if you don't understand the other person.